Chicago's public school system is in serious financial trouble. Some Republicans want the state to intervene. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues and Illinois Public Radio. And with me today is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science with the University of Illinois at Springfield. Professor Redfield, glad you're here again.
Good to be here.
And Andy Maloney, a State House Bureau Chief for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Andy, glad you're back.
Good to be back.
So we've got a lot to cover this week. We're just going to jump right into it. We saw Republican leaders from the legislature bring forth a proposal to allow the state to basically intervene at the school board level with Chicago Public Schools. Folks probably know, if you've been watching the show for a while, Chicago is facing a lot of financial problems, especially in its school system. Professor Redfield, how did folks react to this thought of the state coming in to intervene when the state itself doesn't have a budget and hasn't had a budget for over 6 months?
Well, it certainly was very unpopular with both the mayor of Chicago, the officials within Chicago school system, and then Democrats within the legislature, particularly Chicago Democrats. The idea of the state managing the Chicago schools, certainly there are people on the Republican side of the aisle that think that would be positive. I'm sure there are some people, particularly people who live in the suburbs and downstate, who might view that positively, except when you get to the point that, how are you going to fix it without having more money? And so if this is a prelude to the state spending more money on the Chicago public schools, the support may get even thinner.
Well, and when this proposal came forth, there were a lot of kind of pot calling the kettle black jokes because the state really doesn't have its financial house in order. But the state has the power to do this with other school systems, not with CPS. So what were some of the arguments for extending this to CPS, and why do they get this kind of pass on the ability for the state to come in?
Well, CPS has, like you said, more control over its own finances. People in Chicago contribute both to the pensions for CPS, but also around the state. It's interesting that you would want to jump in on Chicago's problems because, as Dr. Redfield said, you're having a hard enough time managing your own house and keeping your own house in order. But the governor wanted this, maybe the impetus arguably is sort of in his turnaround agenda that he's proposed for the rest of the state. I mean, he wants to curtail union power. He wants to sort of eliminate the prevailing wage, and this type of maneuver, in addition to allowing CPS to declare bankruptcy, would sort of help him in those endeavors.
Well, and Professor, you touch on the possibility of the state having to chip in some money to help CPS out. It seems like there's a good chance that could be happening no matter what happens with the school board, right?
Yeah, I think that you're going to have, if we're going to fix that, it's going to take money. There's no question about it. And you're going to have to get some kind of, what the governor is proposing is initially just managing by the state, which we have done in other school districts, and that raises issues about representation. This is certainly not Flint, Michigan, in terms of what we're the disaster we're talking about here, but it is in fact taking away local control, which is a big deal for the governor. He talks all the time about local control, but now we're essentially saying that you can't manage, and therefore the state should take over and manage. But it becomes leverage against the mayor. He'd like the Chicago mayor to help him with convince the legislature to pass business reforms, and so it is upping the ante. It's turning up the heat in terms of, not only are we not going to give you a bailout, but how about if we take over your school system? And so, there's a huge game of chicken.
It's a nice school
played
system
here.
we have there. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it.
Yeah, and so it is, all of this plays out in this larger political play of, how are we going to get a state budget? How are we going to get some decisions out of Springfield? And the governor clearly would like the mayor to help him put pressure on the Democratic leaders. And one way to do that is to essentially, make, put out something that would be very, I think distasteful to the mayor of Chicago and to Chicago citizens, and kind of hold it out there. So this becomes, as with most things, it's got, it works at a couple of different levels.
And Dr. Redfield, to add to upping the ante, we come on this show, it seems every week, and mention something about the rhetoric, or the level of rhetoric. And this might, be one of those, like in the top 5 or something, in terms of the heat that the leaders and the governor and everything are kind of going back and forth. We saw Governor Rauner in a press conference say the mayor has failed on so many different levels, and he outlined each one and he said he's failed. Leader Radonio, Senate Republican leader, talked about taking this control away from the local government, getting it away from the inbred political culture in Chicago. And so you have that sort of as another level, like you said, of this debate playing out.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense, Professor Redfield, for the governor to kind of pile on Rahm right now, because everyone else is. And CPS doesn't have a great reputation both in the city and outside of the city as far as being managed well or doing well in the past few years, right?
Exactly. I mean, we have a new management team because the person that the mayor brought in is under indictment and probably going to jail for fixing a contract, his original kind of manager of that. And so we brought in a new management team. Plus, as you say, the mayor is under siege for the way that he has handled questions of the abuse of police power within minority communities within Chicago. And so there's a lot of vulnerability there in terms of the mayor, and the governor clearly sees this as an opportunity. It is also clear that when the governor came back from Christmas vacation that he pretty much had decided to go on the offensive in terms of a whole bunch of issues. And so this becomes part of it. I mean, he's been very aggressive over the last 3 weeks in terms of collective bargaining. There's been a whole bunch of things, and this is just one more thing. And so we've seen a change in style, not the goals that he wants, but certainly a change in tactics and style in terms of how the governor is dealing with the Democratic legislature.
And we should add too that these types of proposals wouldn't really, I don't think, be able to pass in the General Assembly. It's controlled by Democrats, and even President Cullerton came out and said this is just mean-spirited.
Yeah, I was going to say, you mentioned rhetoric. I mean, that's all this is, right?
Yeah. And as you said, it's sort of a way that, the governor knows that the mayor is vulnerable right now, and this is something he can do, and then come back later and say, I tried to help out. I offered him a chance for us to help him out of this, and they didn't want to take it.
While we're on the subject of education, I'd like to move on to higher education, which is also in fiscal trouble in the state currently. Since there has not been a state budget approved, the state funding to higher ed has not been going out. Professor Redfield, what's going on? Some of the universities are starting to come forward and say that they could be in some real trouble real soon.
Yeah, and right now it's Chicago State, and they have said that kind of March 1st, if we don't borrow some money, if we don't get some money from somewhere, we may have to, start shutting things down. And you declare a financial emergency, you can, you start laying people off, you start cutting people's salaries. And, it's clear that they are under a tremendous amount of pressure. That's just one of a number of the regional schools that are under pressure. University of Illinois is under great pressure, but it also has great reserves. ISU is probably in the best shape of the remaining universities. But everybody is under huge pressure. And we are not funding MAP grants, and which are the monetary assistance to students. And the combination of those means that there are lots of campuses where they're worried about their ability to finish the semester. We may get some movement. In the past, there have been enough Republicans that have kind of jumped ship on some of these issues like childcare that the governor has essentially done a strategic retreat. And so releasing some money for MAP grants, releasing some money for universities, certainly a possibility. But there's not a lot left to argue over in terms of what we're not funding. And so I guess I would not be surprised if both sides did not allow the situation to get to the point where you've got a campus that's on the brink of closing before, just because they don't know who's going to really get the blame for it. And it's a bad situation for students, for faculty, for janitors, for everybody who works for universities. It's very precarious. And again, if higher education, and we're talking community colleges here, are kind of part of our economic strategy and the way that we build and develop our economy, then we're doing tremendous damage to higher education already, and we could have a real disaster here, which is starting, like lots of things, is starting to be the point where it seems counterproductive.
Well, but Andy, the governor's response so far, at least from his administration, has been very, looking to universities to kind of shape up and make some reforms and do some cost cutting. What are we hearing from Rounders folks? Right.
Well, one of his deputies basically sent out a response to, I think it was Senator Pat McGuire, called for 168, 170 million to be released for the MAP grants. And governor's office said, we'll look into this, but we have to have some trade-offs too. We haven't looked into how fiscally responsible these universities are. Maybe there's some waste we can cut, and if we really want to, release this pressure point, we want some changes to go with it. But like you've said, universities are already starting to feel this, and throughout the state budget crisis, we've talked about, what is a shutdown in reality versus sort of a shutdown where money's still getting paid, but it's not, people are still going to work. And I think what these universities are saying, this time the shutdown is actually going to happen. We could close campus, and that's beginning to look like an only option for some of them. Now, others are in better shape, and others have said, maybe faculty can work without pay. Maybe we'll have to do something with labor contracts, but it's pretty dire.
Yeah, the University of Illinois has kind of responded and said, we've made some cuts, we'll make some more, we hear you. But then again, they are in the kind of safest, probably, fiscal position right now. But some of these things the governor's pointing to are not new. They're things that lawmakers from both sides of the aisle have, kind of raised in appropriations hearing, as we've seen, cuts needing to be made throughout the state budget. So there may be some things that are workable on his list, perhaps in the future, if not immediately?
Yeah, I think that's possible. Well, not possible. I think that's very likely. There's you can always be more efficient. You can always be more effective, and so that's certainly worthy. But at the moment, you can't make cuts in a budget you don't have. Number one. Number two, if you suddenly release a lot of higher education money, either in MAP grants or appropriations to higher education, when you haven't changed the revenue structure or the other spending, then that just worsens your cash flow.
Because there's no money there.
There's no money there. And so if we fund MAP partially and fund higher ed partially, then we're increasing the chances at the end of the fiscal year we'll be in such a cash flow crisis that we won't be able to make school aid payments. We go in the hole every day because we're spending money at a rate much greater than we're taking it in. And so we really are between a rock and a hard place. If we fund higher ed, then we're increasing our cash flow and our debt problems in ways that are going to put pressure on the other things we say we value, like elementary and secondary ed, like meeting consent degrees, on social services. So this just gets cumulatively worse and worse, and everything is connected.
Well, I remember a time a few years ago when all we talked about on the show, it seemed like, was pensions and pension reform, and now it's all budget and lack of a budget. But we're circling back to pensions yet again. Since the Supreme Court tossed out the attempt at pension reform, there's really nothing in place that has been substituted to try to bring down the costs or address the issue. The governor had a press conference this week coming out to say that he supports a plan that Senate President Cullerton has proposed. And then immediately thereafter, the Senate President said, no, that's not my plan. And they started to disagree about whether they agreed or not. Andy, can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, so the governor came out and said, while I don't think it goes far enough, I will support a plan that the Senate President basically has been floating for a little while now. And that's giving state workers, public retirees, the choice between keeping these cost of living adjustments, this level of benefits that increases, but paying for their health care, or sort of the other way around, where you keep the health care aspect, but the cost of living increases are not as high. The governor said this is President Cullerton's plan. President Cullerton came out and said, it's not my plan because the governor still wants to take wages out of collective bargaining. And he's saying, the governor, is saying that this is the only way you can make that plan work, is if they don't have control over that aspect of their pensions. So it's continuing that theme of maybe, the governor's office and the leaders sort of mixing signals, at least on the Senate side. I guess on the House side, they don't really mince their words. They kind of each seem to know where they stand. But there are questions about its constitutionality as well.
Well, this concept is called consideration, and as Andy explained, it would let employees choose between one thing or the other. Professor Redfield, I think the plan the governor is pitching now is based off pay increases, though, correct? Or is healthcare in the mix still?
No, you're saying if you agree to reduce your COLA, your automatic salary increase when you retire, then as you get raises during the course of your career, those raises will become part of the base in which your pension is figured against. If you choose not to freeze your COLA, essentially, if you say, no, I want the 3% every year, then that freezes your salary as to what you're still going to get increases, but you can't count them as the 70% or 80% that you're using in the formula to calculate your pension benefits. And so consideration, a legal concept, means you're giving a trade, and most people look at contract law are somewhat skeptical of this, that you're not allowing somebody to say, I just assume keep what I have, because that's not an option. You either have to have a smaller basis on which to figure your pension on, or you have to forego the salary, the automatic cost of living increases that you were guaranteed when you signed up. So, whether it's constitutional or not, we don't know. But it is also, everything comes back to budget. If you can put something out there and it takes a couple of years to litigate it, then you might be able to cook the books and say, well, this is going to save us. They've already said this will save $1 billion a year. So is that $1 billion less that you have to put in the state budget on the revenue side until it's litigated? And so, we're going to try to save money. That's, that the whole idea is that one of the ways to balance the budget is to raise taxes. Another way to balance the budget is big cuts, and one of the huge drivers of the state from the spending budget, from the spending side, is pensions. And so, if there's a way to get to it, then it relieves pressure on the budget. If there isn't, then we just have to pay the bills and figure out how to balance the budget somewhere else.
Well, Andy, I think you make the point. Whatever the trade-off is for consideration, the issue here is that Rauner wants to focus on collective bargaining, and that's just a no-go with the Democrats.
Right. Yeah. They've indicated they're adverse to that idea sort of unequivocally, and I'll let Professor Redfield explain the nuances of the deal or the proposal next time. But the issue still to me is constitutionality. We saw after the pension decision that you mentioned from the Supreme Court that, well, there was some support for this consideration model, and that, at least in part, stems from a footnote in that opinion. But I would say that it seems like they're describing a different situation in that. So there is some support for consideration, but as you said, it's still murky, I think, at best.
And we should be clear, just briefly, that we are talking about the pensions of Tier 1 people who are currently working for the state. If you're a Tier 2 person, then you've got an entirely different pension situation with a much lower pension benefits. If you're a retiree, that seems to be completely off the table as far as the state Supreme Court is concerned. And so this is not, this is not everybody that's drawing or is going to draw a pension. This is just those employees who came in before we and were under what we call Tier 1 before we started hiring people under a reduced set of circumstances, which is Tier 2.
Well, it's something else that happened this week that may not be on a ton of people's radar, but Professor Redfield, since you're here, I'd like to talk to you about it. You're our campaign finance expert. The governor gave a pretty big chunk of money to someone's PAC this week, and those of us who watch, legislative elections found that fairly interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, and we're talking about an independent expenditure group, which was funded by people who are associated with the governor. I mean, clearly, it's called Turnaround Illinois. Mm-hmm. So by the
the governor's PAC.
Yeah, he doesn't, because it's an independent expenditure committee. Supposedly, there's no coordination.
But it has a really
candidate.
Interesting name.
Yeah, and so you gave $1.8 million to Liberty Principles PAC, which is a group run by Dan Proff, who's a talk show host and a candidate for office, and this PAC has been spending a lot of money in legislative elections, both Republican primaries and general elections. They're very conservative, not only fiscally conservative, but they're also socially conservative. Used to be the big funder of this was a guy named Jack Rozier. After he died, one of Rauner's big supporters, Richard Uihlein, started providing a lot of the funding for this PAC. Now the governor, who all of us claims I have no social agenda, it's just about the economics, we now put $1.8 million into this PAC. They're sitting on about $4.5 million, and by comparison, the House Minority Leader and the House and the Senate Minority Leader, Durkin and Rodogno, currently only have about $2.2 million in their PACs. And so the assumption is this money is going to be spent to go after, say, in the Springfield area, Sam McCann is a Republican representative who has voted against the governor and has an opponent who has helped, in terms of the people that helped get him on the ballot, were people who worked for the governor. And so it looks as like this money will be spent, some of it in primaries, then a lot of it in the general election, where it isn't the governor or the Republican Party that's raising the ad about abortion or gay rights. It's Liberty Principles PAC, and so you've got a voice coming in there that people will not, they'll see who paid for it, but they won't immediately, connect the dots in terms of where the money came from. And it's just one more point at how expensive this election is going to be. The governor's sitting on $20 million. There's another committee that has about $9 million that's associated with him. The two Republican leaders have about $14.5 million. You've got political action committees maxing out on Democratic representatives that don't have primary opponents, but they're getting maximum contributions from labor unions because they're going to be targets in the fall. And so the amount of money we're going to spend on races is just going to be astronomical. We spent $4 million on a Senate race 2 years ago, 4 or 5 House races. We spent $1 million on each candidate.
Which was pretty remarkable at
yeah,
that
those
time.
were all, you know, and that's a ton of money. And now we're talking about, you know, easily doubling the amount of money or tripling the amount of money that we've got available for legislative elections. So it's going to be, you know, there'll be a point where you can't effectively spend that much money, but we're certainly going to try to find out where that point is.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to talk with our guests a little bit about the State of the State address, which is coming next week. Andy, tell us a little bit about what the speech historically is for, and you know what are folks expecting to hear from the governor?
Yeah, basically, it's sort of an introduction, I guess you could say, to that year's specific, you know, topics of the moment. The governor will usually come in and paint a picture of, you know, how the state is doing. In the recent years, it's not been so good. And basically, formerly Governor Pat Quinn and now Governor Rauner have had to acknowledge that there are these problems and here's how we're going to address them. How he comes off of, you know, the first year where he introduced his turnaround agenda and talked about pension deals and everything, and to see not so much of that happen and still not have a state budget and then come back the next year. I don't know, you know, specifically what he'll say, but traditionally that's sort of the message, and it'll be interesting to see how he paints the picture this year.
Well, we just have a few seconds left, but Professor Redfield, are you expecting that he might be a little fiery in his rhetoric since what we have seen since he's come back from Christmas?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's going to talk about things that we need to do, new initiatives that, you know, will make us great if I just could get the Democrats to cooperate. And normally these speeches have a lot about for you know, first, second year of a governor's term, here are the great and wonderful things that I've done. That list is pretty short in terms of substantive things, and so it's going to be an unusual speech from a number of perspectives. And I'm going to be really interested to see how he plays it.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Kent Redfield and Andy Maloney, and we'll talk about that speech, I'm sure, some next week. We'll see you next time on Capitol View.